Summer 1949. NATO was just signed. World War II ended 4 years ago. In post-war Vienna, there's a third man. In Oceania, there is only Big Brother. You think maybe 2 plus 2 equals 4, but that can't be right. You're experiencing double vision. Our guest today is James Simpkin. He's a part-time PhD student explaining Labor's ballistic missile defense policy from 1997 to 2010, a strategic relational approach. He's a teacher by profession, and he's also undertaking a blogging, vlogging, and podcast experiment called Primitive Accumulation. So he's here to talk with me about 1984 and the film The Third Man. So I'm very excited to get this sort of perspective on these stories, both from mid-1949. And so thank you for coming on, James. And so the basic concept here, of course, is these are both released 3 months apart. 1984 comes out June 8th. The Third Man comes out September 1st. They're both from England, as is James, and so you have these different stories emerging out of this post-war, dawn of the Cold War moment, and James was very eager to talk about 1984, and I was particularly eager to talk about it with him and his background, because one thing that I think bothers me with the sort of legacy of the novel is that it's, of course, very influential and it has wide-ranging applicability, but it has sort of deteriorated into a very broad shorthand for any sort of, government control, propaganda, surveillance, anything like that. It's just like it's 1984, it's Big Brother, it just becomes a shorthand for all of that. And so what I'm interested in is thinking back to the specifics of the novel and how it emerges out of this moment in 1949. And so, James, would you like to introduce some of the novel?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. And I must say, this is a great format, pairing the two different types of media, the book and the film, to pull out what zeitgeist were informing those at that time. And I think that's really important, what you say about this shorthand with Orwell, because people pull that out, Orwellian, the thought police, etc., all these different phrases. And it's also important to remember that Orwell himself was a little bit of a complicated individual on this. So he wasn't completely anti-authoritarian. He wasn't completely anti-thought police, so to speak. For example, there's this infamous list that he wrote for the BBC, I believe, about alleged communist sympathisers. Put that to one side for one moment. I mean, I think some of the key themes that are informing 1984 and The Third Man, which I'd never watched before, it was great, and that's the first film I've seen from that particular director. I'm definitely going to watch more. But one of the main themes coming out of that is erasure. Okay, so in 1949, we get the Soviet Union test their first atomic bomb, and that has the potential to erase mankind. What we get with 1984 is we get this theme of erasure through Winston Smith. He is going to be an unperson. He is going to be erased. He's going to be shot in the back of the head at some point. He doesn't know when it's going to happen, and that will be the end of him. He will go down the memory hole. Whereas the protagonist in The Third Man, Lime, the bad guy, he tries to erase himself. He tries to fake his own death, in order to escape to the Russian side, but eventually, Martins catches up with him and he's brought back to life. So we see that interesting dichotomy between Smith being erased, or Smith trying to live and ultimately being erased, balanced with Lime trying to erase himself, escape, but then being brought back into consciousness, so to speak. And also another really key theme arising out of that Cold War zeitgeist, which again fits in with my thesis a little bit about ballistic missile defense, although that didn't exist then, was in 1949 you get the foundation of NATO. Okay, so you get the world coalescing into these two blocks. Obviously, the NATO countries of North America and Western Europe, and the Warsaw Pact countries of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. And absolutely, that's being played out right there in The Third Man, where you've got Vienna, occupied Vienna, with the different zones. And again, in 1984, what have we got here with NATO and the Warsaw Pact? You've got Oceania versus Eurasia. Okay, so we have these very, very, me coming from it more of a fan of 1984, very much these themes of Oceania versus Eurasia and the atomic bomb. So much more we can explore here. I'll pass it back to you, Tim.
Oh, thank you. That's a great intro. So yeah, The Third Man is a film that I'm a big fan of, and I was excited to see how well it lined up with this novel. And so yeah, rewatching it, I was surprised to see how overtly it's in this post-war context, how this sort of structure of Vienna, the sort of economic collapse, the just even the physical ruins of many buildings creates this scene for this sort of seedy crime world. One of the first things we learn about is that everyone there is running some sort of racket, and so it starts out where Holly Martins, who is brought in from America to see his friend Harry Lime. Holly's a writer. He writes what they call cheap novelettes, little like murder mysteries and westerns type things. And so Harry brings him in to supposedly write for some sort of medical charity. He's not really quite sure what the job is, but he's broke, so he brings him in. He goes to Vienna, and so the introduction is that everyone's sort of running some sort of scheme, but he doesn't believe that his friend would. Although we later learn actually that Harry was always a bit of a schemer, and that when he was 14, he taught Holly the sort of 3-card Monte, where you have 3 cards and you shuffle them around and you try to pick which one's like the winning card, and it's never going to be one of the ones there. And so that's exactly the trick that he pulls, where there was supposedly 2 men. It turns out there was a 3rd man on the scene, and so you're supposed to think there's some sort of scheme to have killed Harry Lime, and it turns out is actually, as you were saying, a scheme to hide his or fake his death so he can get away. But there's this dynamic going on of this collapse of sort of morality in this context, where one of the characters, Baron Kurtz, says that, oh, even I've done things that would have been unthinkable before the war. And so the scheme that Harry gets up to is there's a shortage of penicillin, and so he thinks, well, I'll pay someone off to steal some, and then I'll dilute it, and I'll sell that at a high cost, and that ends up having catastrophic effects. But you have Holly, who's primed from his sort of literary background, I think, in terms of these murder mysteries and so on. And so he thinks that the military police major Calloway is trying to frame Harry Lime. He thinks there's some sort of corruption going on, and so he misses the sort of trick that Lime is pulling. And there's this idea where his whole ability to stay in Vienna throughout the story, when it turns out he doesn't actually have this job he was supposed to have, is that he gets brought in by this guy Krabben, who is the leader of this sort of propaganda team. And so he's like, you know, we've never hosted an American author before. I'd like you to come deliver a lecture soon, and we'll put you up in a hotel and all of that. And so his ability to be here and do his little investigation and stuff and live out the life of one of his sort of cheap novel characters is under this pretense that people think he's going to speak in a very high art sense about the modern novel and stuff. And so when he gets to the lecture, it's like people are asking him about James Joyce, and they're asking him about the stream of consciousness and all these sort of modernist things, and he's talking about westerns and stuff, and everyone's like leaving and such. But the advertised topic is about the crisis of faith in the modern novel. And so this is this dynamic where, you know, after, you know, Darwin and things like that, people begin to lose faith in this idea of this fixed morality, that, you know, that there's a God, and there's a strict morality and good and evil, and what do you believe in, and all. And through to the end, actually, the Holly, when he eventually meets Harry Lime and he knows what he did, he's like, do you still believe in God? He's like, oh, of course. But, you know, and then he's looking down on the people below, and he's like, would you care if one of those dots stopped moving forever? And he's sort of taking morality into his own hands, and the whole novel has these sort of inversions and relays it very well through his sort of camera angles and the music through what was called a zither, apparently. It's very excellent soundtrack. But there's a great scene I love at the beginning when Holly finds out that Harry Lime is dead. There's the porter explaining things, and he's looking up at him from the stairs, and the porter's looking down, and he's like, oh, you're too late. Harry Lime is already in hell, and he points up to the sky, and he's like, or heaven, and he gives like a thumbs down, pointing downward. And so part of it is this joke where his language isn't very good, but it's, you know, intentionally reflective of this wider sense of this moral collapse in the post-war. And then we get that further sort of stylistically through this descent into the underworld of the sewers toward the end, which is what allows Harry Lime to sort of navigate outside of the grid of the military police who sort of observe the city proper. And so yeah, I was really interested in those sorts of meta dynamics around, you know, he's brought in as a writer, and he's thinking about one sort of story, and he's thrown for a loop, and he doesn't really understand the crisis of faith thing he's brought in to talk about. He doesn't really understand things about the modern novel. And also critically, we can get to later, he really sort of doesn't understand this woman Anna, who is sort of another major sort of driving force in the sort of story. But yeah, maybe you could talk more about this sort of collapse, this economic and moral collapse going on in these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you're talking about the world stood on its head, and that's so apparent in both these medias. You know, as you mentioned, we're talking about Vienna bombed about a bit, as the character describes it in The Third Man. Airstrip 1, still a ruin. The main difference that you see how morals are approached in these two films is that the character Martins in The Third Man is a very moral character. He wants to do the right thing, and I'll get into some examples of that. Whereas Winston Smith in 1984 is a completely immoral or amoral character. And there's kind of a bait and switch with that, because Smith wants to do something good. He wants to overthrow the party and create freedom, but he's willing to do anything to do that. When he first meets O'Brien, and him and Julia are asked what they're willing to do, and O'Brien says, "Will you throw acid in the face of a child if it will further the aims of the underground?" And Winston replies, "Yes, absolutely." Whereas in The Third Man, the thing that breaks Martin's back, so to speak, is being taken to the hospital where the children who've been terribly brain damaged by this dilution of the penicillin given to meningitis patients. That's what turns him to wanting to dob his friend in, so to speak. So there's that nice inversion there. Martin is a good person, and he wants to stand by his friend, even to the point where he's willing to let him get away literally with murder, but then he sees the consequence of what Lang's been up to and changes his mind. Whereas Winston Smith is wanting to do bad means for a good end. Yes, whereas Martin's is wanting to do good means for a bad end. So there's that complete inversion. And I think that's also reflected in some of the aspects of Anna and Julia. So both Anna and Julia in 1984 and Anna in The Third Man are these very kind of matter of fact, they're kind of nihilistic, they've kind of been broken by the situation, they both want to survive, but neither of them, not through cruelty, but have just accepted death. Death is the way of things. Julia and Winston will have their fun for a time, but then they will disappear and that will be it. They will die. Whereas with Anna, at the point when Martin's realised, well, maybe Lyme was murdered, and she says, well, what does it matter whether he's murdered? He's dead, isn't he? This is the outcome of war. So there is that real inversion of morality there.
Yeah, so that was a great point. And so one thing I think is interesting in terms of really getting at the sort of distinct visions offered by these two different figures. So so you have George Orwell as the author of 1984, and then with Third Man, so you have directed by Carol Reed, and then also it's written by Graham Greene, who I think is a sort of major source for plotting out this idea of this post-war Vienna and what's going on there. So there's a bit like there's two sort of visions driving the film, but you have basically the two works, and so the vision with the Third Man is as you were saying, Holly Martins is this strictly moral character. He wants to do the right thing, and what we see throughout the film is that basically keeps failing him, where he's trying to sort of back his friend, and then it turns out that he was completely wrong-headed in that, and he tries to help Anna get out of the city, and it turns out that he doesn't understand her motives and what she wants, and he's actually being sort of duplicitous, and so he doesn't even really say goodbye to her because he knows that he can't quite sort of pull that off, that she's going to stick with Harry Lyme, even knowing that he brain damaged all those kids. And then so at the end, you have this inversion where Anna earlier ditches her train because she doesn't want to sort of be the price that Holly pays to capture Harry Lyme, and she wants to sort of stick with him. She still loves him, and at the end, Holly sort of ditches on the idea of catching his plane because he wants to go and walk with Anna, and so it ends with she just completely blows past him, and he's sort of just left alone in this vast, sprawling road in the middle of the cemetery, and so you have this scene where he's like amid all of this death, which is the sort of larger post-war context. He's trying to be this sort of moral guy, but he's sort of he has his friend, and he has this sort of prospective lover that he's after, and he really sort of just doesn't sort of work out for him. Whereas in 1984, it's an interesting dynamic where, so he is very grossly immoral, which is something that I had forgotten about until I was rereading it. But so yes, he says he would throw acid in children's faces, and he also says, you know, would you accept doing something that would get like a bunch of people killed, and you know, would you accept things that would basically cause all this sort of mass destruction and chaos and stuff, presuming that the long-term gain is this sort of political revolution? And he's like, yes, yes, absolutely. But it's an interesting dynamic where the structure of the party is they maintain power through propping up these very extreme outbursts. So that's the idea in an overt way with the 2 minutes hate, where people just sort of go nuts, you know, reacting to this intense propaganda, and that keeps them sort of energized to the cause. And even though in Subversion, you have Julia's whole job is that she creates, um, you know, what the proles think is illegal books, and you know, it turns out, you know, it's actually just made within the party, and so they're putting these out in this sort of machinic way, where it's just you have like 4 rotating stories, and then they put things together to make new books and pump them out, and it's this sort of fake release. And then Winston Smith's sort of initial transgression is that he gets a diary, and he starts writing down original thoughts, and he starts writing things about how he hates the party. And it turns out that he was sold this diary by a thought police, this sort of inner party force who goes and tries to catch people thinking thoughts against the party. And so he's sold the diary by one of those disguised as the sort of antique seller, which is, I guess, it's a really perfect role, because you find people who want these sort of things that are intentionally not produced anymore. And so it's this interesting dynamic where they want to evoke confessions, of course, because the whole idea is to bring out people who aren't completely sold on the propaganda, so they can correct them. And so you have this transgression, which he thinks is liberating, but is actually sort of just intentionally designed. And so I think that there's maybe some slight defense, although, you know, it's hard to say like, oh, he's justified in saying he would throw acid in children's faces, but it's very much, I think, designed as Orwell imagines it, as you get people so riled up in this either or, like either you're wholly committed to the party in every sense and you reject even your own senses to believe what they say, or you know, are this complete evil. The enemy is always absolute evil, which is why when the war enemy switches sides, you have to believe you're always at war with that enemy. And so he's caught up in this mental framework where he thinks, oh, you know, either I do the party, or I have to be prepared to do any extent of evil. And so it's you know, as a person, it's very sort of unforgivable, but it's an interesting vision from Orwell to think how they sort of play both sides, basically.
Yeah, several things coming out of that. I mean, one thing that's so apparent about the tonal difference between 1984 and The Third Man is 1984 is so bleak. You know, just thinking about what you were saying then about Winston writing that confession, he's actually, and it says this in the novel, he knows he's going to die. It's like he's suicidal, basically. He knows that at some point, as he first writes those first letters, that he will be caught and he will be shot. And then eventually, you know, when they meet up, Julia will be shot. It's really bleak. It's a really bleak ending, and I like it for that. I don't always like a happy ending. Whereas The Third Man, you know, it has some humour in it. But just coming back to that ending point again, it made me think of some similarities there. at the very end of The Third Man, you've got Martins there in the graveyard, and it seems like it's autumn or winter, and the trees look pretty bleak. And it reminds me of the scene, that very wistful scene at the end of 1984, where Smith sat, bleary-eyed, just drinking his time away in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, with the trees looking pretty bleak and just waiting for things to end. But there is no closure. Winston knows he's going to be shot one day, but he's not sure when. Martins is just left there, propped up against the side of the vehicle. What's going to happen to him now? He's still in Vienna. He's got Calloway to help him out. And that just reminded me of another point that you were making there, Tim, about the attitude towards authority. So 1984 is a very anti-authoritarian book, obviously, and that's why it gets picked up by a lot of different people, and the terms get misused a lot by different conspiracy theory groups, you could say sometimes. Whereas in The Third Man, the authority figures are good. Major Calloway, he's part of the British Army, and he's the hero. Well, he's the authority figure, let's say, and he's seen to be a good figure. So that's two major differences there, I felt.
Right. Yes. So there's the inversion in The Third Man, where it starts out he thinks he's sort of on this just crusade against the sort of corrupt police, and then it sort of winds its way into showing how actually even though they're kind of like rough and they end up punching Holly in the face at the beginning of the film, they're ultimately good guys sort of serving the common good and so on, and so so he's working with them, which is framed very differently from the idea of like ultimately the party in 1984 wants to bring you in to work with them. I was interested in this idea. So that they're both caught up in this rhetoric of the proletariat, and so in the Third Man, when you're in this Ferris wheel scene I was talking about before, they're looking down, and Harry Lime is sort of presenting his sort of moral defense of what he did. He says, nobody thinks in terms of human beings. Governments don't. Why should we? They talk about the people and the proletariat. I talk about the suckers and the mugs. It's the same thing. And in 1984, so you have basically these, it's set up in this sort of propaganda and sort of anti-party propaganda explainer, how there is always a hierarchy of three groups in society. You have the sort of lower class, and then you have the sort of middle, and then upper. And so for the current society, you have the inner party, who sort of, it has basically all the wealth, but it's disguised under this idea that they don't technically own it as private property. It's shared among the inner party. And then you have the outer party, and then you have the proles. And the Winston Smith, interestingly enough, he starts out as the sort of prole, and then he sort of ends up working for the party, and he has this ascension, but then he keeps thinking in some ways he would be more free if he was outside of it. There's all these interesting dynamics where if you're in the lower class, they don't think you're smart enough to really need constant surveillance and things like that. Whereas if you're in the outer party, you basically are caught in this point where everything is constantly monitored, everything you do, everything you say, and to the extent possible, they try to figure out everything that you think. And in the upper party, they get certain privileges where suddenly they can turn off their televisions that are also cameras, but only for up to maybe 30 minutes. So even with them, there's a sort of this limit. But but Winston and Julia live this temporary sense of freedom where they get out this rundown room full of bugs and rats and stuff with all of this old furniture, and sort of just live this carefree life outside of work. Here, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the sort of class dynamics and how that's being sort of envisioned.
Well, yeah, I'll come to class, but as you were speaking then, Tim, something that was in my mind coalesced, and I came up with this phrase, the indecipherable other. So in The Third Man, you have a lot of scenes whereby there's German speakers, and one character in particular was never named, but if you look in the notes, she's called the German landlady. So Anna's landlady is this woman, an old woman, haggard-looking woman, who sort of harangues the authorities when they come to get Anna. And there are other German speakers, and you don't know what they're saying, but they're obviously having an impact on the plot because they're giving information that you're not party to as an English speaker. And this made me think of the nature of the proles in 1984, because they almost do speak another language, in the fact that they speak like a very broad Cockney accent. It's set in London, and they've got their own turns of phrases. But not only does Winston find it difficult, they find it difficult to talk to Winston, he finds it difficult to talk to them, because they are not concerned with the kind of existential issues that he is concerned with. You know, in 1984, the proletariat have been debased to such an extent that, you know, the only thing they care about is, as you know, Smith says, you know, gambling and the horses and that kind of thing, and drinking. So there is that distinction between these indecipherable others that sort of get in the way of the protagonist, and in a sense give the protagonist away to a certain extent. So, for example, when Martins is not able to understand what the different German speakers are saying, and that gets him into trouble. So the figure of, I forget the character's name, but the shop owner in 1984, who turns out to be a government agent, he is kind of part of the proletariat, but he's a little bit more lower middle class, shall we say, and he is the one that entraps Julia and Winston. So these people you can't understand have a role in tripping you up in the end.
Yeah, so the shop owner Charrington, and so there's actually, you know, an interesting thing where he has that sort of Cockney accent, and then when they go to arrest him, he shows up and like his appearance is more like cleaned up, and he's completely dropped the accent. He speaks in this very formal way all of a sudden, and so it's all fake. Whereas with Winston, the he thinks at times of like this idea of just going off and living among the proles, but he one of the things that stops him is that he doesn't think he could fake the forms of speech. But the idea that you brought up is interesting, that he's also in a completely different mode of thought, much more existential, caught up in these sort of grander concerns and such. And so there's, you know, there's that depiction of a sense of something being true to the parties concerned, which is that basically once you're brought into the sort of outer party work, that introduces these thoughts about, you know, basically the workings of the party, that if you're in the sort of lower class, the sorts of life and work you're caught up in doesn't really involve you in that bigger picture. You know, there's the woman outside of the shop and their little apartment, who her whole life is just having children, preparing food, cleaning clothes, and, you know, she's like sings through it all, and it's something he sort of admires. But it's this very, you know, physical, labor intensive existence that's very different from Julia is caught up in the fiction department, and Winston goes back and corrects news records which go against the sort of current definition of reality. And so once you're caught up in that sort of sort of intellectual work, then you need to be sort of monitored and caught up in, and they need to enforce your conformity to the sort of party line. And so there's this, one of the big ideas is the double think, where you need to know something is clearly not, doesn't logically play out in some way, but you need to wholeheartedly believe whatever it is the party needs you to believe. And so I was interested in that idea, because one of the core ideas with your primitive accumulation project is that cognitive dissonance is good, actually. And so I was curious your thoughts on doublethink and how Orwell sort of sets that up.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Tim. And I suppose that really does show how much of an influence 1984 and Orwell has had on me, because I read that when I was about 14 or maybe 14 to 16. And it is my favourite book. I know that's sometimes a trad thing to say, but it is my favourite book, and I've read all of his books. I've read most of his political writing. The only thing I haven't got, which I would love to get, is an entire volume of everything that he wrote. But a lot of that's out of print or costs hundreds of pounds. But again, coming back to the cognitive dissonance, and this is why Orwell is one of my heroes, is because he did have this notion of truth. And that's outlined in 1984. A book that just arrived for me today, which I'm looking forward to read, is this called The Ministry of Truth, a biography of George Orwell's 1984, which is about the writing of the book and the things that were going on. But at the beginning, it's got a quote there from 1984, and it says, "There was truth and there was untruth, and if you clung to the truth, even against the whole world, you were not mad." And Orwell has this another line from his political writings where he says, "The truth is still the truth, even if it's written in the Daily Telegraph." Now, the Daily Telegraph is a conservative newspaper in the UK, and he was a lifelong socialist, not an authoritarian communist, but a democratic socialist. But the point that's getting across is, you should always read against yourself. If you are of a particular point of view politically, or whether it might be religious or whatever point you are, you should always read the other side. You should always try to engage with strongman arguments, not strawman arguments. And in that way, you may experience, as I do often, and it's painful, but I enjoy it because I feel like I'm getting nearer to the truth. You experience this mental anguish whereby you have this strong belief, and then you read strong arguments against it, and your whole worldview can be shattered. But from those fragments, you sort of build them up, and you get a picture of the truth. And I think that's what Smith is trying to do. When he's trying to hold on to what's true, he's trying to save things from the memory hole, so to speak. But if I may, I'd like to riff on that a little bit more, and what 1984 means to me, because I think it very much inoculated me. Again, I'm being a bit funny here, but against going full commie, so to speak. So, I don't mind putting my heart on my sleeve. So I consider myself sort of a left-wing person, a democratic socialist, if you want to put that in English terms, a supporter of the Labour Party. But there is something within me which is attracted towards communism, or at least Marxism in a theoretical sense. And I think 1984 did, by showing so explicitly where totalitarianism can lead, it had a big impact on me, making me think, you need to read against people who are communists or Marxists or whatever. And two real life experiences chimed in with that a little bit as well. So one was growing up after the end of the Cold War. My dad, who was a plumber, he went to Romania with a charity, and they were fixing up the orphanages. And there was a young man who became friends with my dad, and came across and lived with us for a little while to learn English. And he often spoke of, the horrors of living under Ceausescu. And also, kind of randomly, one of my mum's friends at work her husband he was Hungarian, and he got out of Hungary as a teenager, but him and his sister were rounded up during the Hungarian uprising of 1956. His sister was actually shot. He was put in a concentration camp for political dissidents, and he had a tattoo on his arm that's got a serial number. So again, these two, reading 1984 and then coming across these characters, these individuals, helped give me that critical sense politically, I think. Helped me stop going down sort of totalitarian mindsets. So I think this is why 1984 is so important today in teaching us to think for ourselves. Sorry if I've gone off topic there a little bit, Tim.
Oh no, not at all. I was interested in that personal dynamic for you with the novel, where I think it has, in terms of these competing visions, and really this whole idea you were saying about taking one idea and putting it up against a competing idea, and really like grappling with that space, I think is actually maybe part of the core idea with this podcast series, is basically, don't just look at 1984, look at The Third Man, but see what happens when these two visions from the same moment really come together. But 1984 is this really big picture kind of book in a lot of ways, where, especially because in the middle, there's a fairly long section that's just this sort of essay explaining how the party works and its history, and how these sorts of terms were developed and such. And, that I think comes in part from George Orwell was also a great essayist, and so on. And so he's writing this novel with these characters, but it also has this sort of like core essay bit in the middle that's just laying out this idea about history and the sort of political scene and where things might be heading and why. And there's also a big point in there about warfare, basically, that there's this need for constant warfare, and but you're not necessarily competing over anything real. You just sort of need this enemy, and so on. And so this I think is this sort of vision from the sort of dawn of the Cold War, where it's no longer, World War I, World War II, fighting to a specific end. It's just this sense that the sort of cycles of war need to sort of just go on endlessly now. But The Third Man, I think it gives this much more ground level sort of view, where it's all about this sort of world where people get caught up in, the sort of struggle to get by in sort of post-war Vienna and so on. And, the different directions they turn, where, people turn to various levels of rackets, and Harry Lime and his associates go to one of the sort of most egregious versions. Holly Martins gets a sort of offer to go into it with them, and sort of refuses to go down that path. And Anna is sort of in an interesting periphery to this, where she doesn't really go along with it exactly, but she's also doesn't have the same sort of steadfast rejection of Harry Lime. And so I was really intrigued, in terms of these two different visions, where one is about, the sort of grand scheme of everyone is sort of just part of a vast system and needs to get sort of steamrolled into something that can be sort of scientifically understood, and then you detect these changes and you correct these changes, and it's all very mechanical. Whereas The Third Man really maintains this much more personal sense, where it's about these sort of nicely sort of realized people with their competing moral structures, all sort of operating within the same space. But I was intrigued to hear about, your sort of personalization of 1984, and really grappling with being, something like maybe a character, caught up in this world, and how do you grapple with these dynamics of expected beliefs, and how they're framed in these sort of stark oppositions that's maybe not quite the truth, and the truth really requires working through these contradictions that the party in the novel is set up to prevent you from really working toward that sort of nuance.
No, I think that's a really good point you made there, Tim, about especially with the third man, as you say, how it brings these themes to life. Because 1984, although it obviously has characters in it, it is more structural because it has those passages in it where, Goldstein's theory of oligarchical collectivism, which is so cool to me that it's got passages from a book in another book, both of which are fictional books. But with the third man, there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of sort of the strategy stuff at the beginning, and there's a little bit, as you say, where Lime's outlining about the proletariat and the suckers and etc. like that. But it is, as you say, much more personal in the third man. But I suppose what's great about that is you've got these big general sort of meta-narratives going on and these discourses, but what the third man does, it sort of makes the general particular through the characters. So we have the ruins of war, we have people wheeling and dealing, and what is this making the individual characters do? And that's played out at a really individual level. And I think that's where it goes with when Lime is running through the sewers. It reminded me of Smith's descent into room 101. They go way down into the belly of the beast, so to speak, and that's where they get their comeuppance.
Right, yeah. I actually, so I first encountered the third man through a course on sort of like studying the sort of like literary reflections of infrastructure, and so this is a sort of film version of that, but there's this interesting dynamic where the structure of the sort of underground infrastructure and how it's built into the town square in a sort of semi-obscured way that allowed Harry Lime to disappear, and how it's sort of revealed in parts through sort of rubble and such, allows for these sorts of chases and escapes and disappearances, and sort of the sort of magic card trick in a way, is sort of very interesting part of that. The one last thing that I want to talk about, you can maybe bring up a topic as well, but you had brought up early on how these two works are very tonally different, and so the third man has these humorous moments, and so I mentioned the soundtrack before as well, but it's really so masterful where it's in some ways very fittingly dramatic, and it gives this sort of intense feel to the sort of eerie sense of being watched, or the heightened tense to the chase scenes and so on. But it also it has this weirdly sort of upbeat feeling to it as well, and so even where the sort of subject matter is quite dark, there is this undercurrent to it where it's a bit of a sort of romp, where running in parallel to these ideas of the sort of cheap novelettes, it's like it's very has a very serious core to it, which I think is caught up in the sort of historical context, but it's also this, it is a mystery, and it is this fun little sort of adventure through this landscape. And so with 1984, it's very much, because it's drawing on these sort of essays, and because I think Orwell's vision of this is maybe sort of much higher stakes than Reed and Green are thinking with the film. you have basically this build up to where he finds these sorts of moments of joy in music primarily, but in the end he's brought to the point where like he can enjoy it. And it's also this dynamic where they make it so you can't really indulge in physical attraction. Everything is sort of for the party. And so it's a sort of tragic ending in a way, but from Winston's perspective, it's interestingly like he sees it as a happy ending, where he has this thought early on about how sort of miserable he is, sort of living as a sort of dissident who's like, can't quite maintain the double think of maintaining the party line, even as it's his job, and thinks that he'd be better off dead. And to the end he's still sort of expecting this idea that he'll be killed, but he ends with a bit of a happy thought where it's like the propaganda has won him over to where he can finally be happy living under the rule of the party and Big Brother. And so I thought that there's an interesting thing there. And then with Harry Lime, you have a interesting sort of moment of liberation where before he dies, he's trying to crawl his way out of the sewer. And there's a shot where he just barely slips his fingers up through the grate of the sewer, and you have this sort of light like breeze sound, and you can sort of feel freedom for a moment, and then he sort of agrees to let his friend kill him. Because he realizes, where at the beginning Major Calloway says that the charges against Harry Lime are so serious that it's better off that he's dead. And he basically agrees at the end, is that he wants to basically, he resigns to sort of face the sort of grander religious judgment of God, basically, rather than go off with the military police. And it's such an interesting contrast to me to Winston Smith, who sort of completely resigns to he's in service of the party, and if they want to come up behind him and shoot him at some point, that's just how life is.
Yeah, and this is so rich, Tim. This is so rich. Just as you were talking there, you're talking about Lime and his release, and I just jotted down. Lime is what Winston Churchill would love to be if what Lime was doing was in service of the underground. So if when Lime does that monologue where he says, you see those little dots, if they stop moving and you could make 20 grand for each one, well, just change that with, if they stop moving and you could overthrow the party.
Yeah. So you mean Winston Smith, right?
Sorry, Winston Smith. Sorry, who did I say?
Winston Churchill.
Oh, Winston Churchill. Well, Winston Smith, yeah. So, and with that, and again, as you were talking with Lime there and his resignation at the end, Winston has a passive acceptance of his fate. There's no chase scene in 1984. Whereas the third man, obviously Martins is trying to look for his friend, but Lime tries to escape. Winston Smith does not try to escape. There is no, gunfights and people chasing people with police cars. I think there's just that tired resignation of warfare and what it's done to people in both cases.
Right. Yeah. In both cases, there's this destruction. Oh, one thing also I was really interested in is, so the third man is really set in, basically the moment it's filmed in and coming out. Whereas 1984 is, of course, it's set in 1984, or what they believe is 1984. It's sort of impossible to know the exact year, but it's noted very early on where, you know, the novel is coming out in 1949, and it's sort of suggested that that Winston Smith was born in something like the mid 1940s or so, something like that, right? And so Orwell is actually thinking a bit ahead and imagining, you know, for those being born now, not you know what it's like to live in this precise moment, but like for those being born into this moment, you know, what is the sort of future laid out for them, and so that I think guides this grander concern for the big picture, what the sort of inevitable, you know, flow of certain things are, whereas the third man is really caught up in just this sort of dynamic of, you know, the sort of reality that, you know, there's penicillin shortages and people are, you know, really desperate for money and things like that, and they're running various rackets and so on, and so, you know, I think this was a great sort of pairing to explore.
Absolutely, and I know you want to keep this pretty tight, but I think one theme that that's also running through 1984 and the third man is this issue of sexuality, and in 1984 there's Julia and there's the Red Sasha, the Junior Anti-Sex League, and the way in which sexuality is used to prime people to repress that and bring that energy out in hatred towards the other side. Whereas in the third man, there's this Casanova club, and you're not quite sure whether it's got this seedy side to it. At one point, Martins goes to a club, and I'm not sure it's the Casanova club or it's a different place, and it's obviously there's like it looks like there's some kind of sex work going on there. Nothing graphic, but it's implied there. But again, that shows Martin's virtuous side, because he's having a drink and he can see what's going on, but he chooses to leave and he goes to see Anna. Whereas in 1984, Winston is haunted by this experience that he had with a sex worker. And it's obviously a very harrowing scene. So I think that's another important point that's played within 1984 and the third man.
Right. Yeah. It's this sort of eternal human drive that always needs to sort of be accounted for in any sort of like social political system, and so, you know, in 1984, as with everything else, Orwell imagines what it would be like for a government to sort of completely subject that impulse and so on. Whereas in the third man, you get this interesting sort of, you know, interpersonal moral drama in some ways, or amoral drama of a sort. And see, I know the scene you're talking about, where it's just like, it's just this bar completely full of young women who are all staring him down, and so he, you know, decides to sell out his friend Harry Lime, but his price for it is that Anna will in turn be sort of free. She's going to be otherwise claimed up by the sort of Russians, and she doesn't want to do that. And but as I sort of brought up early on, you know, there's this interesting dynamic where in the end, you know, she just sort of walks right past him, and, you know, had earlier sort of taunted him, you know, that he should find himself a woman. And, you know, as he was like, well, so that should be her. But she's so committed to Harry Lime through everything. She says, you know, no matter what, he's still a part of me. And is especially not willing to go with Holly Martin after he, betrays Harry. And so, yeah, I think, there's that important element to it where, part of what's driving this behavior is these sort of these impulses, and they do get very different visions of that, in part because I think Orwell sort of preempts some of that and then sort of imagines, like, you have this repression, and what does that do? Whereas the third man is basically set in this heavily, policed area, but it has a certain level of lawlessness where a lot of things can, sort of go. And in 1984 as well, it's there's technically no laws. It's just that certain things will get you re-educated or killed, and you don't know what they are because they're not on the books. But and so you also then have to police yourself.
Yeah, they are obviously both romance stories to a certain degree. Unrequited, perhaps in the case of Martin's, who definitely seems to take a shine to Anna, and she rejects him for daubing in lime. But also, in 1984, Winston and Julia both declare that they are both willing to betray each other at the meeting with O'Brien. They state that we will betray each other, we will stab each other in the back, we will denounce each other. So maybe that's, again, a little bit more bleak of an attitude than just unrequited love in the case of the third man.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much here. I know you want to keep this pretty tight, Tim. Just a couple of things which plot holes, if you like.
One thing that didn't quite add up to me was when they sort of fake the death of Lime, is the person who is actually run over, is Lime sort of run over and it's kind of faked, or is that the I believe he's called Habeen or something like that, the other guy? Do they run him over and somehow make it look as though it was Lime? But that didn't quite add up, because other people might have seen that and known that it wasn't Lime, that it was this Habeen guy who ended up being buried instead of Lime.
Right, yeah. So actually, I'm not entirely sure myself on that, right? So the guy that ends up buried in Harry Lime's grave is the guy they bought the penicillin from. So they tie up that loose end,
Yeah.
and so they fake Harry Lime's death. There's a line from the porter who's not being entirely open, and so that eventually he says, "Oh, I'll tell you more. Come back tonight," and then he's murdered because they come after him. But he says the third man looked like this sort of ordinary man. He could have been anyone. And there's this parallel shot to the Ferris wheel scene where Holly Martins looks out the window of this, they're a few floors up, and you see a few people kind of walking around through the street. And so I'm not actually sure if that's Harry Lime as this sort of everyman. He can't quite say that it's him or not. But yeah, so that's the dynamic there. That but basically, the Harry isn't actually hit, and the car is also, it turns out, it's Harry's own driver. So I don't know if they like somehow led this other guy there. My impression is it's all just this faked scene, because otherwise it wouldn't, I don't know if it wouldn't make sense to
Do you think
somehow guide this guy to Harry's apartment.
that it was Habeen that was actually killed? It must have been.
Well, they definitely kill him, but I actually wasn't clear myself if they kill him there or if it's just basically they sort of kill two birds with one stone by faking Harry's death and thereby getting a sort of coffin to put the other guy in.
Well, I feel like we could go 1,000 different routes with this. They're so rich, Tim, but I know you want to keep this fairly tight, so we can wrap up now if you wanted to.
Do you have any other major points you wanted to bring up?
No, I haven't. Well, I could do, but sorry, we might have to cut this a little bit.
That's fine.
My wife's got to go and pick my kids up from school, so
Okay. Yes. So we'll wrap up. You know, I think basically there's this interesting dynamic. You know, we laid out a lot of different distinctions and similarities and these sort of visions. Obviously, they're emerging from very similar historical context, and there's the dynamic I brought up earlier in The Third Man, where it's like, oh, Harry Lime is in hell or he's in heaven, and they're already sort of inherently inverted, and that sort of double think in a way of really sort of trying to understand what exactly is going on is both this sort of surface level mystery of who's in the coffin, who died, was it a murder, why did this all happen, but then there's also the sort of the, I guess, deeper moral mystery of it all, which is what is to be done of all of this, and and 1984 has a much more, I think, in some ways overt sort of didactic structure where it's like, this is the terrifying vision that needs to be avoided, and these are the sort of mental trappings by which they'll try to trap you. And you laid out a great sort of personal vision, I think, of what that looks like for an actual individual to read 1984 and really grow from what is sort of offered there.
And I would say the overarching theme for me coming out of this is the way in which gigantic international forces, like the battle between superpowers, which is evident in 1984 and obviously The Third Man, impacts on individuals, even if it's influencing the way they think and then the way they behave. In The Third Man, in the Cold War, you had a lot of grubby things going on, different countries interfering in different countries' businesses, human rights abuses, supposedly in the name of the greater good or winning the Cold War, by either side. And maybe this is what you see with The Third Man in particular, with these compromised individuals who have their visions of the good, but are willing to make certain sacrifices in order to achieve those. That would be my summary.
That was very good. Thank you for that. And thank you for coming on. It was a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I really, really, really enjoyed it. And I think, as I said, I think it's a really great format, and I'll look forward to seeing this one, listening back to it, listening back to your comments. I thought they were really great. And yeah, thanks for inviting me and having me on to talk about my favourite book, basically. I really appreciate that, Tim.
Yep. Thank you for coming on. A lot of great insights.